An elderly couple was abandoned at sea during a violent storm. What happened next changed everything. Picture this. 73 and 75 years old, married for 52 years, two people who had lived quiet, unremarkable lives in a small coastal town in Maine. The kind of people you'd pass on the street without a second glance. And on a Tuesday morning in late September, their only son invited them on what he called a family trip they'd never forget. He was right about that, but not in the way anyone could have imagined. Because 3 days later, Dorothy and Frank Matheson found themselves alone in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, clinging to each other as a violent storm turned the water into a living nightmare. No boat, no life jackets, no flares, no radio, no way to call for help. Just two elderly people, abandoned at sea, with 20-foot waves crashing over them and the sky turning black above. Their son was gone. The yacht was gone. Everything was gone. And as Dorothy held onto Frank's hand, feeling his grip weaken with every passing minute, feeling the cold seep into her bones, she asked herself a question she never thought she'd have to ask. How did our own son leave us here to die? The ocean doesn't care how old you are. It doesn't care if you're a good person. It doesn't care if you've lived your life right. It just takes. And Dorothy and Frank were moments away from being taken. But here's what nobody knew. Here's the part that makes this story impossible to forget. In that same storm, 20 miles away, a young man was steering his fishing boat through waters he had no business being in. His name was Marcus Chen. He was 26 years old, and exactly 1 year ago on this very day, he had lost both of his parents in a car accident. He wasn't supposed to be out on the water that day. Every weather report had screamed warnings. Every other boat had returned to harbor hours ago. His crew had begged him not to go, but Marcus couldn't stay on land. Not today. Not on the anniversary of the worst day of his life. So he pushed his small fishing boat out into the storm, into the waves, into the darkness, looking for something he couldn't name, searching for a connection to the parents he'd lost, and what he found in those black waters would change 4 lives forever. This is not a story about coincidence. This is not a story about luck. This is a story about betrayal so profound it defies belief, about survival against impossible odds, and about the strange, inexplicable way the universe sometimes brings broken people together exactly when they need each other most. But to understand what happened in that storm, you first need to understand the choices that led Dorothy and Frank into those waters, the life they had lived, the son they had raised, and the unthinkable decision that would shatter everything they thought they knew about family. Dorothy and Frank had lived in the same house in Port Haven, Maine, for 43 years, a small 2-bedroom cottage overlooking the harbor, blue shutters, white picket fence, a garden where Dorothy grew tomatoes every summer. It was the kind of house people drive past and think looks peaceful, cozy, safe, and for most of their lives it had been. Frank had worked as a high school history teacher. Dorothy had been a nurse at the local hospital. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable. They had enough. They had one son, Michael, and if you had asked them 10 years ago, they would have told you they were proud of him, that he'd done well for himself. Michael had moved to Boston in his 20s, gotten into real estate development, made good money. He drove a nice car, wore expensive suits, talked about deals and investments and opportunities. He didn't visit often, maybe twice a year, Christmas and one random weekend in the summer, but he called. Every few weeks he'd call, and Dorothy would always answer with the same hopeful tone. "Michael, how are you, sweetheart?" The conversations were always brief, surface level. He'd ask how they were doing, tell them he was busy, promise to visit soon, and Dorothy would hang up and tell Frank, "He sounds good. He's just so busy." Frank never said what he was thinking, that their son had become a stranger, that the boy who used to sit at their kitchen table doing homework, who used to help Frank fix the fence, who used to laugh at Dorothy's terrible jokes, had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by someone who called out of obligation, not love. But Dorothy held on to hope. She always had. "He'll come around," she'd say. "When he has kids of his own, he'll understand. He'll come back to us." except Michael never had kids. He'd been married once, briefly, in his early 30s. It ended badly. He never talked about it, and as the years went on, the calls became less frequent, the visits even more rare. By the time Dorothy and Frank reached their early 70s, they had accepted a quiet truth they never spoke aloud. Their son had moved on from them. They were part of his past, not his present, and certainly not his future. So when Michael called in late August and said, "Mom, Dad, I want to take you on a trip," Dorothy almost dropped the phone. "A trip?" she repeated. "Yeah, a real trip, on a yacht. Just the three of us. I've been thinking about it for a while, and I want to spend some quality time with you guys. It's been too long." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Frank, who was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, and mouthed, "It's Michael. He wants to take us on a trip." Frank raised his eyebrows, skeptical, but Dorothy was already nodding eagerly into the phone. "That sounds wonderful, honey. When were you thinking?" "End of September. I've got a charter lined up. 3 days just sailing up the coast. Beautiful weather, good food, time to talk. What do you say?" "We say yes," Dorothy said immediately. "Of course we say yes." When she hung up, she was beaming. "He wants to reconnect," she told Frank. "Our boy wants to come back." Frank wanted to believe her. He really did. But something in Michael's voice had sounded off, too smooth, too rehearsed. Still, he didn't say anything, because Dorothy was happier than she'd been in months, and he wasn't going to take that away from her. The weeks leading up to the trip, Dorothy couldn't stop talking about it. She bought new clothes, practical things, she said, for being on a boat, a windbreaker, comfortable shoes. She made lists of things to pack, sunscreen, motion sickness pills, snacks. She talked about all the things they'd finally get to talk about with Michael. Really talk about. His life, their lives, the future. Frank watched her prepare with a growing sense of unease he couldn't explain. "Do you think it's strange?" he asked one night as they were getting ready for bed. "That he suddenly wants to do this? Strange? Frank, it's wonderful. I know, but it's just not like him. People change. Maybe he's finally realizing what's important." Frank nodded. But he didn't sleep well that night, or the night after that, or the night after that. Something felt wrong. But he told himself he was being paranoid, cynical, that Dorothy was right, that Michael was finally coming back to them. He wanted to believe it so badly. They both did. And that's why, on September 24th, when Michael picked them up in his sleek black SUV and drove them to the marina, they ignored the small voice in the back of their minds that was whispering a warning they couldn't quite hear. The yacht was beautiful, a 45-foot luxury cruiser, white and gleaming in the morning sun. The kind of boat that screamed money. "Michael, this is incredible," Dorothy said as they stepped aboard. Michael smiled, that practiced real estate agent smile he'd perfected over the years. "Only the best for my parents," he said. But Frank noticed something. Michael didn't meet his eyes when he said it. The captain was a man in his 50s named Roger, quiet, professional. He shook their hands, helped them with their bags, and explained the basics of the boat. "We'll head north up the coast," Roger said. "Beautiful views, calm waters this time of year. Should be a smooth trip." They set off around 10 in the morning. The weather was perfect. Blue sky, gentle breeze. The kind of day that makes you feel grateful to be alive. Dorothy sat on the deck, wrapped in a blanket, smiling as she watched the coastline drift past. Michael brought her tea, talked about his work, made jokes. For a few hours it felt like old times, like they had their son back. Frank wanted to relax, wanted to enjoy it, but he kept noticing small things. The way Michael checked his watch constantly, the way he had quiet conversations with Roger that stopped whenever Frank got close, the way he seemed tense, distracted. "You okay?" Frank asked him at one point. "Yeah, Dad. Just tired. Work's been crazy." "You sure that's all?" Michael looked at him, really looked at him, and for just a second, Frank saw something in his son's eyes. Guilt, but then it was gone, replaced by that smooth smile. "I'm fine, Dad, just glad we're doing this." That night they had dinner on the deck. Roger had prepared a nice meal, pasta, salad, wine. They talked and laughed, and Dorothy kept saying how perfect everything was, but Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bad. He was right. Around 10 p.m., the weather started to change. The wind picked up. The sky, which had been clear all day, began to fill with dark clouds moving in from the east. Roger checked the weather radar, his expression tightening. "We've got a storm coming in," he said. "Wasn't supposed to hit until tomorrow, but it's moving faster than predicted." "Is it bad?" Michael asked. "Could be. We should head back to shore." "How far are we?" "About 30 miles out." Michael nodded slowly. Then he looked at his parents. "Why don't you guys go down to the cabin and get some rest?" he said. "Roger and I will handle things up here." "Are you sure?" Dorothy asked, concerned. "Positive. You've had a long day. Get some sleep." Dorothy and Frank went below deck to the small sleeping cabin. They lay down in the narrow bed, listening to the sound of the waves getting rougher, the boat starting to rock more aggressively. "Frank," Dorothy said in the darkness. "Yeah? Do you think we're safe?" "Roger knows what he's doing. We'll be fine." But Frank didn't believe his own words, and Dorothy could tell. They lay there in the dark, holding hands, as the storm grew worse. Around midnight they heard voices above. Michael and Roger talking urgently. Frank couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Something was wrong. He got up, steadied himself against the rocking of the boat, and climbed the stairs to the deck. What he saw made his blood run cold. The storm had hit. Rain was pouring down, waves were crashing over the sides of the boat, and Michael and Roger were lowering a small inflatable raft into the water. "What's going on?" Frank shouted over the wind. Michael turned, and the look on his face was one Frank had never seen before. Cold, decided. "I'm sorry, Dad," Michael said, and before Frank could process what was happening, Roger grabbed him. Frank tried to fight back, but he was 75 years old and Roger was much stronger. Dorothy came up the stairs, confused, frightened. "Michael, what's happening?" Michael didn't answer. They forced Frank into the raft. Then Dorothy. "Michael, please." Dorothy was crying now. "What are you doing?" "I need the insurance money," Michael said flatly. "The house, your life insurance policies. I'm drowning in debt, and this is the only way out." Dorothy stared at him, unable to comprehend what she was hearing. "You're going to kill us? The storm will kill you. I'll just be the grieving son." "Michael, we're your parents." "You're in my way," he said, and he cut the rope. The raft drifted away from the yacht into the black, churning water. Frank and Dorothy watched as the lights of the yacht grew smaller and smaller, disappearing into the storm. They were alone, in the middle of the ocean, in the worst storm either of them had ever seen, and their son had just left them there to die. The raft was tiny, barely 6 feet across, designed for emergencies, not for surviving a full-blown storm. Waves crashed over them constantly. Rain pelted their faces. Wind screamed around them like something alive and angry. Dorothy was in shock. She sat in the bottom of the raft, soaking wet, shaking, unable to speak. Frank tried to stay calm, tried to think, but there was nothing to think about. No oars, no radio, no flares. Michael and Roger had made sure of that. They were going to die out here. He looked at Dorothy, and his heart broke. After 52 years of marriage, after a lifetime of protecting her, taking care of her, loving her, this was how it ended, betrayed by their own son and left to drown in the dark. "Dorothy," he said, pulling her close, "I'm so sorry." She was crying, but she shook her head. "Not your fault," she managed to say. "Not your fault. I should have known. I should have seen it coming. How could you? How could anyone?" They held each other as the storm raged around them. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like an eternity. At some point, a wave hit them so hard that the raft flipped. They went under. Cold, dark, disorienting. Frank grabbed for Dorothy but couldn't find her. Panic seized him. "Dorothy!" He surfaced, gasping, looking frantically, and then he saw her, 10 feet away, struggling to stay afloat. He swam to her, fighting the current, fighting his own exhaustion. He reached her, grabbed her, pulled her close. The raft was gone, flipped away by the current. They had nothing now, just each other, and even that was slipping away. Dorothy was getting weaker. Her grip on Frank's arm was loosening. "Frank," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I'm tired. I know, honey. I know. But you have to hold on. Just a little longer." "I don't think I can." "Yes, you can. We've been through worse." "Have we?" Frank wanted to say yes, wanted to lie to her, to give her hope, but he couldn't think of anything they'd been through that was worse than this. "Dorothy, look at me." She did. Her eyes were barely open. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you every single day for 52 years, and I'm not losing you now. Do you hear me? I'm not losing you." She tried to smile. "You're stubborn." "Damn right I am." A wave crashed over them. When they surfaced again, Dorothy's grip was even weaker. "Frank, no, don't you dare say goodbye. I'm sorry. You have nothing to be sorry for. I should have listened to you. About Michael. You knew." "Dorothy, I just wanted to believe he still loved us." Frank felt tears mixing with the salt water on his face. "He did love us. Once. He got lost. Do you think he'll regret it?" Frank didn't know how to answer that. "I think he already does," he finally said, though he didn't believe it. Dorothy's eyes closed. "Hey," Frank shook her gently. "Stay with me. So tired." "I know, but you have to fight. Please, for me." She opened her eyes again. Barely. "Frank? Yeah? If this is the end, I'm glad I'm with you." "It's not the end." But even as he said it, he felt his own strength fading. His arms were getting heavy. His legs could barely keep him afloat. They were both going to die. He knew it. She knew it. This was how their story ended. In the dark, in the cold, alone. And then, through the rain and the darkness, he saw something. A light. Small, distant, moving. "Dorothy," he said urgently. "There's a light." She didn't respond. "Dorothy, stay with me. There's a boat." He tried to wave, but he could barely lift his arm. He tried to shout, but his voice was lost in the wind. The light was moving away. "No!" Frank screamed. "Please, help us!" But it was too late. The light disappeared, and Frank felt something break inside him. They were going to die right here, right now. He pulled Dorothy closer, wrapped his arms around her, and closed his eyes. If this was the end, at least they'd be together. And then he felt it. Something solid beneath him. He opened his eyes. A boat, a small fishing boat, right next to them, and standing on the deck, reaching down with both hands, was a young man with dark hair and desperate eyes. "Grab on!" the young man shouted. Frank reached up with his last bit of strength and grabbed the man's hand. Marcus Chen had been 17 when his parents died. A drunk driver. Wrong place, wrong time. The cliché that destroys families. His mother, Lynn, had been a high school art teacher. His father, David, had been a fisherman, working the same waters his own father had worked. They were good people, kind people, the kind of parents who showed up to every school event, who made dinner together every night, who still held hands after 20 years of marriage. And then, in 1 second, they were gone. Marcus spent the next 9 years trying to figure out how to live in a world without them. He took over his father's fishing boat, kept the business running, but it wasn't the same. Everything felt hollow. Every anniversary, every birthday, every holiday was a reminder of what he'd lost. And today, September 27th, was the worst day of the year, the day they died. Marcus had tried to stay on land, tried to distract himself, tried to pretend it was just another day, but by late afternoon he couldn't take it anymore. He needed to be on the water, his father's water, the place where he felt closest to the man who had taught him everything. So he took the boat out, alone, even though every weather report was screaming at him not to, even though he knew it was dangerous. He didn't care. Maybe part of him hoped something would happen, that the ocean would take him too and he could finally stop feeling this crushing weight of grief. But as the storm hit, as the waves grew massive and the sky turned black, Marcus realized something. He didn't actually want to die. He was just tired of being alone. He fought to keep the boat steady, to navigate through the chaos, to get back to shore, and that's when he saw them. 2 shapes in the water, barely visible through the rain. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but then he saw them move. People, 2 people, clinging to each other, seconds from going under. Marcus didn't think. He turned the boat, fighting the current, pushing the engine as hard as it would go. He got close, cut the engine, ran to the side. "Grab on!" he shouted. The older man reached up. His hand was shaking, barely able to grip. Marcus grabbed his wrist and pulled. The man was heavy, dead weight. But Marcus pulled with everything he had. He got him onto the deck, then the woman. She wasn't conscious. Marcus checked for a pulse. Found one. Weak, but there. He dragged them both into the cabin, out of the rain. Wrapped them in every blanket he had. Started the engine and pointed the boat toward shore. The storm was still raging, but Marcus didn't care. He was getting these people to safety, whatever it took. Frank regained consciousness first. He was lying on a hard floor, wrapped in blankets, shaking violently. Everything hurt. He tried to sit up, and a young voice said, "Easy, don't move too fast." Frank turned his head and saw the young man crouching next to him. Asian features, early 20s, soaking wet, exhausted. "Dorothy," Frank croaked. "Where's—" "She's right here," the young man said, gesturing to the figure lying next to him. "She's breathing, but she needs a hospital." Frank looked at his wife. She was so pale, so still. "How long were we in the water?" he managed to ask. "I don't know, but you're lucky I found you." Another few minutes, and the young man didn't finish the sentence. Frank looked at him, really looked at him. "Who are you?" "Marcus. Marcus Chen." "Thank you, Marcus. You saved our lives." Marcus nodded, but there was something strange in his expression, something haunted. "What were you doing out here?" Frank asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Today's the anniversary of the day my parents died," he finally said. "I couldn't stay on land. I needed to be out here. Needed to feel close to them." Frank felt something twist in his chest. "I'm sorry," he said. Marcus shrugged. "It's been 9 years. You'd think it would get easier. Does it?" "No." They sat in silence as the boat rocked through the waves. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said. "Of course. How did you end up out here? In a storm like this?" Frank hesitated. How could he explain what had happened? How could he put into words the betrayal, the horror, the impossibility of what their own son had done? "Our son," Frank finally said, his voice breaking. "Our son left us there to die." Marcus stared at him, not comprehending. "What?" "He needed money, insurance money, so he brought us out here and abandoned us. In the storm." Marcus's face went through a series of expressions. Shock, disbelief, rage. "Your own son did this?" Frank nodded, unable to speak. "Where is he now?" "Gone on the yacht. Probably back on shore by now, preparing to report us missing." Marcus stood up abruptly, paced the small cabin. That's unforgivable." "I know. We have to report him. We have to—" "We will," Frank said quietly. "But first, we need to get Dorothy to a hospital." Marcus nodded, took a breath, forced himself to focus. "We're about an hour from Port Haven. I'll radio ahead, get an ambulance ready." "Thank you," Frank said again. Marcus met his eyes. "You don't have to keep thanking me." "Yes, I do. You didn't have to stop. You didn't have to risk your life, but you did." Marcus looked away. "My dad always said the ocean brings people together for a reason. I never really understood what he meant, until now." They made it to shore just after midnight. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet, eerie calm. An ambulance was waiting at the dock, along with police officers and curious onlookers who had heard the radio call about 2 people rescued from the storm. Paramedics rushed onto the boat and lifted Dorothy onto a stretcher. Frank tried to follow, but his legs gave out. Marcus caught him. "I've got you," he said, helping Frank onto the dock. At the hospital, doctors checked both of them. Hypothermia, exhaustion, dehydration, but alive, miraculously, impossibly alive. Dorothy woke up 3 hours later in a hospital bed, Frank sitting beside her, holding her hand. "Frank," she whispered, "I'm here. Are we? We're safe. We're okay." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I thought we were going to die." "So did I." "What happened? How did we—" "A young man found us. Marcus. He pulled us out of the water." Dorothy closed her eyes, fresh tears coming. "I want to thank him." "You will." The police came later that morning. 2 detectives, a man and a woman. Both looked tired and skeptical. "Mr. and Mrs. Matheson," the male detective said, "we need to ask you some questions about what happened." Frank told them everything. The trip, the storm, Michael's confession, being thrown into the raft and abandoned. The detectives took notes, their expressions carefully neutral. "That's quite a story," the female detective finally said. "It's not a story," Frank said firmly. "It's what happened. Your son, Michael Matheson, reported you missing this morning, said the storm separated you from the yacht and he couldn't find you. He's lying. He seemed very distraught. He's a good actor." The detectives exchanged glances. "Mr. Matheson, do you have any proof of what you're saying? Proof, physical evidence, witnesses, anything that corroborates your version of events?" Frank felt his stomach drop. "The captain, Roger, he was there. He helped Michael. We spoke to Captain Roger Hammond. He says the same thing as your son, that you were accidentally separated in the storm. He's lying too. So your son and the boat captain are both lying, and you're the only one telling the truth?" "Yes." The detective sighed. "Mr. Matheson, I understand you've been through a trauma. Sometimes, in extreme situations, memories can get confused. My memory is not confused," Frank said, his voice rising. "My son tried to kill us." "Frank," Dorothy said softly, putting her hand on his arm. The detectives promised to investigate, but Frank could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe him. Michael had gotten ahead of the story. He and Roger had their version aligned, and two elderly people who had nearly drowned in a storm weren't exactly the most credible witnesses. After the police left, Frank sat with his head in his hands. "They think I'm confused," he said. "They think I imagined it." "We know what happened," Dorothy said. "That's what matters." "Is it? Michael's going to get away with this. He's going to collect the insurance money anyway because everyone thinks we lost our minds out there." There was a knock on the door. Marcus stepped in carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need these," he said, offering them. Frank took one gratefully. "Thank you for everything." Marcus nodded, then hesitated. "I heard what you told the police," he said quietly. "About your son." Frank looked away. "I know how it sounds. It sounds like you're telling the truth." Frank met his eyes. "You believe me?" "Yeah, I do." "Why?" Marcus sat down in the chair by the window. "Because I saw your face when I pulled you out of the water. That wasn't confusion. That was betrayal. That was someone who had just been hurt by someone they loved. I know that look." Frank felt something loosen in his chest. Someone believed him. "What are you going to do?" Marcus asked. "I don't know. The police don't believe us. Michael and Roger have their story straight. We have no proof. There has to be something." "Like what?" Marcus thought for a moment. "The yacht. If they abandoned you, there would be evidence on the yacht. The raft would be missing. There might be signs of a struggle. The police already checked the yacht. Michael showed it to them this morning. Everything was in order." "Of course it was. He had all night to clean it up. So what do we do?" Marcus leaned forward. "We don't let him get away with it." Frank wanted to believe that was possible, but he was tired. So tired. "Marcus, you've done more than enough. You saved our lives. You don't owe us anything else." "Maybe not," Marcus said. "But my parents taught me something. They taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about showing up. It's about doing the right thing even when it's hard." He paused. "You two don't have anyone right now. Your son betrayed you. The police don't believe you. You're alone." "We're used to being alone," Dorothy said softly. "You don't have to be," Marcus said. And in that moment, something shifted. 3 people who had been strangers 12 hours ago. 3 people who had lost everything. 3 people who needed each other more than they knew. "Let me help you," Marcus said. "Let me be the family you deserve." Dorothy started crying. Frank reached over and gripped Marcus's hand. "Why?" Frank asked. "Why would you do this for us?" Marcus's eyes filled with tears. "Because exactly 1 year ago I lost my parents, and I would give anything to have them back, to have one more day with them, one more conversation, one more chance to tell them I love them." He took a shaky breath. "You two deserve to have someone fight for you, someone who sees your value, and maybe you can help me remember what it feels like to have parents again." Frank couldn't speak. Dorothy reached out and took Marcus's other hand. "We would be honored," she whispered. And just like that, a new family was born, not by blood, but by choice, by survival, by the strange and beautiful way broken people can heal each other. Marcus moved fast. Over the next 3 days, while Dorothy and Frank recovered in the hospital, he did something the police wouldn't do. He investigated. He started with the marina where Michael had chartered the yacht, talked to the dock workers, asked questions, and he found something interesting. Michael had chartered the yacht under a fake name, paid in cash. No credit card trail. Why would someone do that, unless they were planning something they didn't want traced back to them? Marcus documented everything, took photos, got statements from workers who remembered the transaction. Then he went to the harbour master's office and requested the yacht's departure and return logs. The yacht had left at 10 a.m. on September 24th, with 4 passengers listed: Michael Matheson, Captain Roger Hammond, Dorothy Matheson, and Frank Matheson. It had returned at 3 a.m. on September 27th, with only 2 passengers, Michael Matheson and Roger Hammond. The official report stated that Dorothy and Frank had been lost at sea during the storm, but here's what Marcus noticed. The yacht had returned 3 hours after the storm had passed. 3 hours. What had they been doing for 3 hours? Marcus had a theory. They'd been cleaning the boat, making sure there was no evidence. He took his findings to Frank and Dorothy. "This is good," Frank said, reading through Marcus's notes. "But it's still circumstantial. It proves Michael was acting suspicious, but it doesn't prove he tried to kill us." "There's more," Marcus said. He pulled out his phone and showed them a screenshot. It was from a life insurance website, a page showing policy details. "I did some digging. Your son took out life insurance policies on both of you 18 months ago, $2 million each, with himself as the sole beneficiary." Dorothy gasped. "How did you find this?" "I have a friend who works in insurance. She owed me a favor." Frank stared at the screen. "He's been planning this for over a year." "It looks that way, but this still doesn't prove anything. Having life insurance on your parents isn't illegal." "No, but taking out unusually large policies right before they die suspiciously, that gets investigated." Frank met Marcus's eyes. "You want to force an investigation." "Exactly. If we can get the insurance company to question the payout, they'll do their own investigation. They have more resources than the local police, and they have a financial incentive to find the truth. It was a good plan, but there was a problem." "Michael has to file the claim first," Dorothy said, "and he hasn't yet." "He will," Marcus said. "He just needs to wait a respectful amount of time, make it look like he's grieving." "How long?" "A few weeks maybe, a month at most." Frank nodded slowly. "So we wait. We let him think he got away with it. And when he files the claim, we strike." "Exactly. It was risky. It required patience, but it was the best shot they had." Over the next 2 weeks, something beautiful happened. Marcus didn't just help Dorothy and Frank build their case. He became part of their lives. He visited them every day in the hospital, brought them meals, sat with them, talked. They learned about his childhood, about his parents, about the fishing business he was struggling to keep afloat. And he learned about them, about their 52 years of marriage, about the life they'd built, about the son who had broken their hearts long before he tried to kill them. "You know what the worst part is?" Dorothy said one afternoon as the 3 of them sat in her hospital room. "It wasn't just the storm. It wasn't even being left to die." "What was it?" Marcus asked gently. "It was realizing that we never really knew him, our own son. We thought we did. We thought he was just busy, just distant. But the truth is, he stopped being our son years ago, and we were too blind to see it." Frank took her hand. "We saw what we wanted to see. I should have listened to you. You always knew something was off. Dorothy, this is not your fault. None of this is your fault." Marcus watched them, his heart aching. His own parents had been so different, so present, so full of love. And these 2 people, who had tried so hard to be good parents, had been betrayed in the worst possible way. It wasn't fair, but maybe, just maybe, he could help give them something his parents never got, a second chance. "When you get out of here," Marcus said, "you're not going back to your house." Frank and Dorothy looked at him. What do you mean? Michael knows you're alive now, and if he's desperate enough to try to kill you once, he might try again. You need to be somewhere safe, somewhere he can't find you. We don't have anywhere to go, Dorothy said quietly. Yes, you do. You're coming to stay with me. Marcus, we can't. You can, and you will. I have a house. It's small, but it's safe. And you'll be there until this is over. Frank wanted to argue, but he knew Marcus was right. They weren't safe, not yet. Okay, he finally said. Thank you. Marcus smiled. Stop thanking me. We're family now. And he meant it. Dorothy was released from the hospital 2 days later. Frank had been released the day before, but he'd refused to leave without her. Marcus drove them to his house, a small cottage about 20 miles up the coast from Port Haven. It was modest. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a living room with windows overlooking the ocean. But it was warm, lived in, safe. Marcus gave them his parents' old room. He'd kept it exactly as they'd left it. Their clothes still in the closet, their books still on the nightstand, photos on the dresser. I couldn't bring myself to change it, Marcus said quietly, as Dorothy and Frank stood in the doorway. I kept thinking they might come back. Dorothy put her hand on his shoulder. They would be so proud of you. Marcus's eyes filled with tears. I hope so. That night, the 3 of them had dinner together. Marcus cooked. Nothing fancy, just pasta and salad. But it was the first real meal Dorothy and Frank had eaten in weeks. They sat at the small kitchen table, and for a moment everything felt normal, like a family having dinner. Marcus told stories about his parents, about fishing trips with his dad, about art projects his mum would bring home from school. Frank told stories about teaching, about students who had changed his life, about the day he met Dorothy. Dorothy talked about nursing, about the babies she'd helped deliver, about the lives she'd helped save, and as they talked, something healed in each of them. They were all broken. They'd all lost something irreplaceable, but together they were less alone. 3 weeks after the storm, Marcus's phone rang. Unknown number, he answered. Marcus Chen. Yes? This is Detective Sarah Williams with the Maine State Police. We met at the hospital a few weeks ago. Marcus's heart rate picked up. I remember. I'm calling because there's been a development in the Matheson case. What kind of development? Michael Matheson filed a life insurance claim yesterday. $4 million total. $2 million for each parent. Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline. That was fast. We thought so too, which is why we're taking a closer look at the case. You believe them now? You believe what Frank and Dorothy told you? There was a pause. Let's just say we're exploring all possibilities. We'd like to speak with Mr. and Mrs. Matheson again. Can you tell me where they're staying? Marcus hesitated. Something felt off. Why do you need to know where they're staying? For their safety. And for our investigation. Their safety from what? Another pause. Longer this time. Mr. Chen, are you refusing to cooperate with a police investigation? Marcus's instincts were screaming at him. I'll have them call you, he said. They can set up a time to come in. Mr. Chen... He hung up. His hands were shaking. He walked into the living room where Frank and Dorothy were reading. We have a problem, he said. The call had been fake. That was the first thing they realized. Marcus called the police station directly and asked for Detective Sarah Williams. We don't have anyone by that name, the dispatcher said. Someone was looking for Dorothy and Frank, and they were willing to impersonate a police officer to find them. It's Michael, Dorothy said, her voice shaking. He knows we're alive, and he's trying to find us. But how did he get Marcus's number? Frank asked. Marcus thought for a moment. The hospital. I filled out paperwork as your emergency contact. It would have had my information. So he's desperate, Frank said. He filed the insurance claim, but now he knows we can contest it. We're a threat to him. More than a threat, Marcus said. If the insurance company investigates and finds evidence of attempted murder, he goes to prison. So what do we do? Dorothy asked. Marcus stood up, paced the room. We go on offense, we stop hiding, and we expose him. How? We get him to confess. Frank stared at him. You think he's just going to admit what he did? Not voluntarily. But if we can get him in a situation where he thinks he's safe, where he thinks he has the upper hand, people slip. They say things they shouldn't. You want to confront him. Yes, that's dangerous. Everything about this situation is dangerous. But sitting here waiting for him to find us, that's more dangerous. Dorothy looked at Frank. Frank looked back at her, and something passed between them. That wordless communication that comes from 5 decades of marriage. "What's your plan?" Frank finally asked. Marcus laid it out. They would arrange a meeting, public place, lots of witnesses. They'd wear wires, record everything. If Michael said anything incriminating, anything that proved he'd tried to kill them, they'd have evidence. Real evidence. Not circumstantial, not theories. His own words. "It could work," Frank said slowly. "Or it could get us all killed," Dorothy added. "I won't let that happen," Marcus said firmly. Dorothy smiled sadly. "You're a good man, Marcus, but you can't promise that." "Then I'll do everything in my power to make sure you're safe. Both of you." Frank stood up and put his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "We trust you." The meeting was set for 3 days later. Marcus had a friend at the local news station, a reporter named Jessica Park, who had covered the story of the tragic loss at sea. Marcus told her the truth, all of it, and Jessica, hungry for a real story, agreed to help. She would be at the meeting, hidden, with a camera crew. If Michael confessed, it would all be on tape, and it would be impossible to cover up. The location was a public park overlooking the harbor, neutral ground, open space, hard for anything to go wrong. Marcus texted Michael from a burner phone, pretending to be someone who had information about his parents. "I know what really happened on the yacht. Meet me at Harbor View Park, 2 p.m. Thursday. Come alone, or the police get everything." Michael responded within minutes. "Who is this?" "Someone who was watching." "How much do you want?" "We'll discuss that in person." Perfect. Michael thought someone was trying to blackmail him. He'd come. He had to. Thursday arrived cold and grey. Dorothy and Frank were hidden in a van parked across from the park, watching through tinted windows. They were both wearing recording devices. Small, nearly invisible. Marcus was waiting at a bench near the water. At exactly 2 p.m. Michael appeared. He looked different than he had 3 weeks ago. Thinner, tired. There were dark circles under his eyes. Guilt, Frank thought. Or fear. Maybe both. Michael walked up to the bench slowly, looking around. "Where are you?" he called out. Marcus stood up. Michael froze. "You," he said. "Me. What the hell is this?" "This is the part where you tell the truth." Michael's face hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You're the one who pulled them out of the water." "That's right. They're alive." "You sound surprised, like you expected them to be dead." Michael's jaw clenched. "I'd been grieving for weeks. I thought they were gone." "Cut the act. There's no one here to perform for." "This is insane. I came here because I thought someone had information about what happened to my parents. Instead, it's you. Why? What do you want?" "I want you to admit what you did." "I didn't do anything. You threw them into a raft and left them to die in a storm." "That's a lie." "Is it?" "Yes, the storm separated us. I searched for hours. I did everything I could." Marcus took a step closer. "Then why did you charter the yacht under a fake name?" Michael's expression flickered. "Just for a second. I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. You paid cash, used an alias. Why would you do that if you didn't have something to hide?" "That's none of your business." "And the life insurance policies? $4 million taken out 18 months ago." Michael's face went pale. "How do you know about—" He stopped himself, but it was too late. Marcus smiled coldly. "Because I investigated. Because unlike the police, I actually believed your parents when they told me what you did." Michael looked around frantically. "Where are they?" "Somewhere safe. Somewhere you can't hurt them." "I never hurt them." "You tried to kill them." "I didn't have a choice." The words exploded out of Michael before he could stop them, and everything went still. Michael realized what he'd said. His face crumbled. "I didn't have a choice," he repeated, quieter now. "I was drowning in debt. I was going to lose everything. They were old. They'd lived their lives. And the insurance money would have solved all my problems. So you decided to murder your own parents. It wasn't supposed to be murder. The storm was supposed to do it. I just gave it an opportunity. Marcus felt sick. Do you have any idea what you put them through? The terror, the pain. Michael's eyes filled with tears. I know what I did, and I've been living with it every day since. Good. Michael looked up at him. Are they really okay? Why do you care? Because they're still my parents. Despite everything. Despite what I did. You lost the right to call them that when you cut that rope. Michael nodded slowly, accepting it. What happens now? Now you face the consequences. And that's when Frank and Dorothy stepped out of the van. Michael saw them and his face went white. Mom. Dad. Dorothy walked toward him, her face wet with tears. How could you? She whispered. How could you do that to us? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't fix this, Michael. I know it doesn't. Frank stood next to Dorothy, his arm around her. You're our son, he said, his voice breaking. Our only child. We would have done anything for you. If you needed money, we would have given you everything we had. You didn't need to kill us. Michael was sobbing now. I couldn't ask you. I couldn't face you. I'd already let you down so many times. So you decided to murder us instead. Michael didn't have an answer for that. Detective Williams, the real Detective Williams, stepped out from behind a tree, followed by 2 uniformed officers. Michael Matheson, she said, you're under arrest for attempted murder. Michael didn't resist as they put the handcuffs on him. He looked at his parents one last time. I'm sorry, he said again. Dorothy turned away. She couldn't look at him anymore. As the police car drove away with Michael inside, Dorothy collapsed into Frank's arms. It's over, Frank whispered. It's finally over. But Dorothy was crying too hard to respond. Marcus stood nearby, giving them space. Jessica Park approached with her camera crew. We got everything, she said quietly. His full confession on tape. Marcus nodded. Good. This is going to be a huge story. I know. The elderly couple abandoned at sea by their own son, saved by a young fisherman. It's incredible. Marcus looked at Dorothy and Frank, still holding each other, both broken and somehow still standing. It's not a story, he said softly. It's their life. Jessica had the decency to look ashamed. You're right. I'm sorry. Marcus walked over to Dorothy and Frank. Let's go home, he said, and together the 3 of them walked back to the van. A family, not by blood, but by choice, by survival, by love. Michael Matheson was charged with 2 counts of attempted murder. His trial lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. The fake name on the yacht charter, the life insurance policies, the timeline that didn't make sense, and most damning of all, his own recorded confession. He pleaded guilty. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in prison. Dorothy and Frank didn't attend the sentencing. They couldn't bear to see him again, but they read about it in the newspaper Marcus brought home. 20 years, Dorothy said quietly, staring at the article. Is that enough? Frank asked. I don't know. Nothing feels like enough. They were sitting on Marcus's back porch, watching the sun set over the ocean. It had been 2 months since the storm. 2 months since everything changed. Do you think about him? Frank asked. Every day. Me too. I keep trying to figure out where we went wrong, what we could have done differently. Frank took her hand. We didn't do anything wrong. We loved him. We gave him a good home, a good life. What he became, that was his choice. I know, but it still hurts. It always will. They sat in silence for a while. Then Dorothy said something she'd been thinking about for weeks. I don't want to go back to Port Haven. Frank looked at her. What do you mean? Our house, our old life. I don't want to go back to it. Too many memories, too much pain. Where would we go? Dorothy looked at the ocean, at the waves rolling in, at the same water that had almost killed them and also brought them to Marcus. What if we stayed here? With Marcus? If he'll have us. Frank thought about it. Their house in Port Haven was paid off. They could sell it, use the money to start over, and Marcus had become more than a friend. He was family now, real family, the kind that shows up, that fights for you, that chooses you every single day. I think he'd say yes, Frank finally said. You think? I know. He needs us as much as we need him. That night, they asked Marcus. He was washing dishes after dinner when they approached him. "Marcus," Dorothy said, "can we talk to you about something?" "Of course. What's up?" "We've been thinking about the future, about what comes next." Marcus dried his hands on a towel and turned to face them. "Okay. We don't want to go back to Port Haven," Frank said. "Too many bad memories there. We want a fresh start." "That makes sense. And we were wondering," Dorothy hesitated, "would it be okay if we stayed here with you permanently?" Marcus stared at them. "You want to live here?" "Only if you're comfortable with it. We don't want to impose." "Impose?" Marcus laughed, but it came out choked. "You think you'd be imposing? We know this is your parents' house, your space. We don't want to intrude on your grief." Marcus set the towel down and walked over to them. "My parents would have loved you," he said, his eyes wet. "They would have welcomed you without hesitation, and I would be honored to have you here." Dorothy started crying. "You mean it?" "Of course I mean it. You're my family now, the only family I have." Frank put his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "And you're ours." They held each other in the kitchen, three people who had lost everything and somehow found each other. Over the next few months they built a life together. Dorothy and Frank sold their house in Port Haven, used the money to renovate Marcus's cottage, adding a small extension with a proper bedroom and bathroom for themselves. Dorothy started volunteering at the local hospital. Frank began tutoring kids at the community center. And Marcus, with their encouragement and Frank's business advice, expanded his fishing operation. He hired 2 employees, bought a second boat, started supplying local restaurants. The business that had been barely surviving was now thriving, and Marcus, who had been drowning in grief, was finally learning to breathe again. People in town started to notice the unusual family, the elderly couple living with the young fisherman. Some people gossiped, speculated, made assumptions. But most people, once they heard the story, were moved by it, by the way tragedy had brought 3 strangers together, by the way they had chosen to be a family when the world had taken their biological families away. Jessica Park's story about what happened had gone national. The storm that built a family, she'd called it. Dorothy and Frank had been reluctant to do interviews at first, but Marcus convinced them. "Your story matters," he said, "not just because of what Michael did, but because of what came after, because you survived, because you found hope again." So they told their story, on morning shows, in magazines, on podcasts, and the response was overwhelming. Thousands of people reached out, people who had been betrayed by family, people who had lost parents, people who had survived their own storms. They all said the same thing. "Thank you for showing us that family is a choice. Thank you for showing us that it's never too late to start over. Thank you for giving us hope." One letter came from a man in Oregon who had been estranged from his elderly parents for 15 years. "Your story made me realize what I was missing," he wrote. "I called my parents yesterday. We talked for 3 hours. I'm flying out to see them next week. Thank you for saving my family." Another came from a young woman who had lost her parents in a house fire. "I've been alone for 2 years," she wrote. "I thought I'd never have a family again. But your story showed me that family can be built, not just inherited. I'm going to start looking for my people now." Dorothy read each letter carefully, crying over most of them. "We did something good," she said to Frank one night. "Out of something terrible, we did something good. We survived," Frank said. "That's what we did, and we helped Marcus survive too. Do you think you'll ever forgive Michael?" Frank thought about it for a long time. "I don't know," he finally said. "Part of me wants to. Part of me thinks I should. But every time I close my eyes, I see him cutting that rope. I see the look on his face, and I don't know if I can ever get past that. Me neither. Does that make us bad people? No, it makes us human." Michael wrote to them from prison. 3 letters in the first year. Dorothy and Frank never opened them. They couldn't. Maybe someday, maybe years from now, they'd be ready to read what he had to say, but not yet. The wounds were still too fresh. On the 1-year anniversary of the storm, Marcus, Dorothy, and Frank went out on the boat together, not far, just a few miles offshore, to the approximate spot where Marcus had found them. They stood on the deck in silence for a while, looking at the water. "I was going to die out here," Dorothy finally said. "We both were," Frank added. "But you didn't," Marcus said. You survived. Because of you. Marcus shook his head. No. You survived because you held on to each other. Because you didn't give up. I just happened to be in the right place. You don't believe in coincidence? Dorothy asked. Not anymore. I think my parents sent me to you. I think they knew I needed you, as much as you needed me. Frank put his arm around Marcus's shoulders. They raised a good man. They would have liked you. We would have liked them too. They stood there for a while longer, and then Marcus pulled out 3 flowers. My mom always said you should leave flowers for the ocean, he explained, to thank it for what it gives you. He handed one to Dorothy and one to Frank. Together, they tossed the flowers into the water and watched them float away. A memorial, not for what was lost, but for what was found. 2 years after the storm, Marcus married a woman named Sarah, a marine biologist he met at a conservation fundraiser. Dorothy and Frank walked him down the aisle together, one on each side. His parents, even though they weren't his parents by blood, Sarah understood. She'd heard the story, and she loved Marcus even more for the way he had chosen his family. The wedding was small, intimate, on the beach at sunset. When the officiant asked, "Who gives this man to be married?" Dorothy and Frank said together, "We do." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. At the reception, Frank gave a toast. 2 years ago, he said, his voice strong and clear, my wife and I were lost at sea. Literally and figuratively, we had been betrayed by the person we loved most in the world. We were drowning. We were ready to give up. He paused, looking at Marcus. And then this young man appeared, out of nowhere, on the worst day of his life and ours, and he saved us. But here's what I've learned in the time since. He didn't just save our lives, he saved our hearts. He reminded us that there is still goodness in the world, still people who show up, still love worth believing in. Marcus, you gave us a family when ours fell apart. You gave us hope when we had none. And now we get to watch you build your own family, your own life, and we couldn't be prouder. He raised his glass. To Marcus and Sarah, may your love be as strong as the waves that brought us together. And may you always remember that family isn't just about blood, it's about choosing each other, every single day. Everyone clinked glasses and cheered. Marcus hugged Frank, then Dorothy, both of them crying happy tears. Thank you, he whispered, for everything. Thank you, Dorothy whispered back, for being our son. Sarah and Marcus moved into a house 2 miles down the coast, close enough to visit daily, far enough to have their own space. Dorothy and Frank stayed in the cottage, which now felt like home in a way their old house never had. They fell into comfortable routines. Morning coffee on the porch, afternoon walks on the beach, evening dinners with Marcus and Sarah, weekends helping with the fishing business, which was now employing 6 people and expanding into sustainable aquaculture. Life was simple, but it was full, and for the first time in years, Dorothy and Frank felt like they had purpose again. They started a non-profit together with Marcus, called it Second Chances. The mission, to help elderly people who had been abandoned or betrayed by their families, to connect them with younger people who had lost their parents, to build chosen families, to prove that it's never too late to start over. The organization started small, just the 3 of them, working out of the cottage, but it grew quickly. Within a year, they had matched 50 pairs, elderly people and young adults coming together across generational lines, filling the spaces in each other's lives. The stories that came back were beautiful. The 78-year-old woman, who had been abandoned by her children, matched with a 24-year-old man whose parents had disowned him for being gay. They became inseparable. She taught him to bake. He taught her to use social media. They were grandmother and grandson in every way that mattered. An 82-year-old widower matched with a 30-year-old woman whose parents had died when she was young. He walked her down the aisle at her wedding. She visited him every Sunday for dinner. On and on. Story after story of people finding family in unexpected places. Jessica Park did a follow-up piece 3 years after her original story. The Storm That Keeps On Giving, she titled it. She interviewed Dorothy, Frank, and Marcus about second chances. You've helped build over 200 chosen families now, she said during the interview. "What drives you to keep doing this work?" Dorothy answered. "Because we know what it feels like to be abandoned, to feel like you have no one, and we know what it feels like to be saved, to find family when you thought you'd lost everything. If we can give that gift to other people, how could we not?" The organization continued to grow. Corporate sponsors came on board. Volunteers stepped up. They opened chapters in other states. And through it all, Dorothy, Frank, and Marcus remained at the center of it. The family that had been born in a storm, now helping others weather their own storms. On what would have been Marcus's parents' 30th wedding anniversary, he, Dorothy, and Frank went back out on the boat, back to the spot where everything changed. Marcus was quiet as they reached the location. "I used to come out here and be angry," he finally said. "Angry that they were taken from me. Angry that the universe was so unfair." "And now?" Frank asked. "Now I think maybe they weren't taken from me. Maybe they were transformed. Maybe they live on through what we're doing, through the families we're helping build." Dorothy smiled through tears. "They do. I'm sure of it." They stood there for a while, the three of them, looking at the water that had almost killed two of them and saved all three. "Do you ever think about him?" Marcus asked quietly. He didn't have to specify who. "Sometimes," Dorothy admitted. "Less than I used to." "Do you hate him?" She thought about it. "No. I'm sad for him. He threw away something precious because he couldn't see its value until it was too late. That's a tragedy in itself." "Have you read his letters?" "Not yet. Maybe someday." "He's been writing to the organization," Marcus said, "from prison, asking if there's any way he can help, any way he can contribute." Dorothy and Frank exchanged glances. "What do you think we should do?" Frank asked. "I think," Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think forgiveness is a process, and maybe someday, if he's truly changed, there could be a place for him, not in your lives. That bridge is burned, but maybe in the work, maybe in helping others avoid the mistakes he made." "That's very generous of you," Dorothy said. "I learned it from you two. You taught me that people are more than their worst moments. That redemption is possible, even when it seems impossible." Frank nodded slowly. "We'll think about it. That's all I ask." They tossed flowers into the water again, a ritual they'd adopted. One for Marcus's parents, one for the life Dorothy and Frank had lost, one for the life they'd found. And as the flowers drifted away on the current, Dorothy said something she'd been thinking about for a long time. "You know what's strange?" "What?" Frank asked. "If Michael hadn't done what he did, we never would have met Marcus. We never would have started Second Chances. Hundreds of families never would have found each other. So you're saying something good came from something evil? I'm saying that we took something evil and transformed it into something good. That's not the same thing." Marcus put his arms around both of them. "You two are the strongest people I've ever met." "We're not strong," Dorothy said. "We're just stubborn." "Same thing," Marcus said with a smile. They stood there until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and then they turned the boat toward home, toward the cottage where dinner was waiting, toward Sarah, who would have a pot of soup on the stove, toward the life they had built together. Not the life any of them had planned, but the life they had chosen. And that made all the difference. 5 years after the storm, Dorothy passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 78 years old. Frank found her in the morning, still and quiet, a small smile on her face. He sat with her for a long time before he called Marcus. The funeral was held on the beach. Over 300 people came, people from the town, people from Second Chances, families they had helped build. Marcus gave the eulogy. "Dorothy Matheson taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn," he said, his voice breaking. "She taught me that family is a choice, that love is a decision you make every single day, and that it's never too late to start over." She was abandoned by her own son, left to die in a storm, and she could have spent the rest of her life bitter and angry. But she didn't. She chose hope. She chose love. She chose to build something beautiful out of something terrible. And because of that choice, hundreds of families exist today that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Hundreds of people have parents, grandparents, children, siblings. Because Dorothy refused to let betrayal define her. She was my mother in every way that mattered, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to honor her legacy." Frank stood by Marcus's side during the funeral, his hand on the young man's shoulder. They held each other up, the way family does. After Dorothy's death, Frank moved in with Marcus and Sarah full-time. They had a baby girl by then, Emma, named after Marcus's mother. Frank became Grandpa Frank to her. He read her stories every night, taught her to garden, took her on walks on the beach, and when Emma asked about the woman in the photos around the house, Frank would say, "That's your Grandma Dorothy. She's watching over us from somewhere beautiful, and she loves you very much." Frank lived another 8 years after Dorothy's death, long enough to see Emma start school, long enough to see second chances expand to 20 states, long enough to know that what they had built would last. He passed away at 83, surrounded by Marcus, Sarah, and Emma. His last words were, "Tell Dorothy I'm coming." At his funeral, Emma, who was now 8 years old, stood up in front of everyone and said, "My grandpa wasn't my real grandpa, but he was real to me, and that's what matters." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Marcus and Sarah continued the work. Second chances kept growing, and every year, on the anniversary of the storm, they would take Emma out on the boat, to the spot where everything changed. They would tell her the story, about the elderly couple who was abandoned at sea, about the young man who saved them, about the family that was born in a storm, and they would throw flowers into the water, in memory, in gratitude, in hope, because that's what Dorothy and Frank had taught them, that storms pass, that families can be built, not just born, that betrayal doesn't have to be the end of the story, it can be the beginning of something stronger, something truer, something that chooses to exist every single day despite the odds. Michael Matheson was released from prison after serving 15 years. He was 58 years old. He wrote to Marcus one last time, "I know I have no right to ask for anything, but if there's any way I could help with second chances, even in the smallest capacity, I would be grateful for the chance to do something good with what's left of my life." Marcus showed the letter to Sarah and Emma. "What do you think?" he asked them. Emma, now 17 and wise beyond her years, said, "Grandpa Frank always said that people deserve second chances, even people who don't deserve them." Sarah nodded. "It's your choice, Marcus. Whatever you decide, we'll support you." Marcus thought about Dorothy and Frank, about everything they had taught him, about forgiveness, about grace, about choosing love over bitterness. He wrote back to Michael, "You can volunteer, remotely, answering emails, helping with outreach. But you will never meet the families we serve. You will never use this for your own redemption story. This is about service, not forgiveness. Do you understand?" Michael wrote back immediately, "I understand, thank you." And so Michael joined the work, quietly, invisibly, helping in small ways. He would never rebuild the relationship with his parents. That bridge was permanently burned. But maybe, just maybe, he could help build bridges for others. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start.